Well, hello there and welcome to another edition of the Big Q. Today we are talking about energy and I'm joined by Mr. Yohhanes Hailu, who is the Economic Affairs Officer in charge of energy policy at the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. Thank you very much, sir, for making time to be with us and welcome to the show.
Thank you for welcoming to the program.
Now, we start off the show, of course, by talking about the SDGs. One of the SDG pillar, goal number 7 actually says, access to affordable, reliable and sustainable energy is crucial to achieving many of the sustainable development goals, from poverty eradication via advancements in health, education, water supply and industrialization to mitigating climate change. However, there is a big gap in sustainable energy. In your opinion, how do we bridge this gap? Will we even be successful to actually achieve it?
I think, as you said, the energy aspect of development has been the missing link in the last round of 15 years development agenda globally, which is MDGs. In this cycle, there is recognition that energy is very central. So it has to be brought back to global policy attention, because unless we make progress on energy capacity, energy supply, we'd have serious implications in terms of achievement of all of that that you mentioned, industrialization, poverty reduction, and so on and so forth. Now, that has been achieved. The policy focus has come at country level, regionally and globally. Now the challenge is, how do we accelerate achievements in that area? For example, if you look at electricity, the global target is saying everyone, universal access to electricity.
Yes.
If you look at clean cooking, we want universal access to clean cooking. If you look at energy efficiency and renewable energy, rapid improvement in doubling the gains in those areas. So these are very ambitious targets. As a result, the challenges come in. One is finance. How are you going to finance all of these ambitious energy initiatives? So there's still a lot of experimentation. If you look at what countries are doing in Africa, they are devoting a big share of their national budget actually to sponsor energy infrastructure development. But that is the initial phase. I believe we need to transition to more diverse financing structure around that, including the role of the private sector. The private sector today is doing only 9% of energy infrastructure finance. That can be accelerated and upscaled. The second challenge we have is we need to work on policy. We have got the policy focus, but we have to create the enabling environment for sustainable energy development. The third aspect is technology. How are you going to bring a lot of the technology transfer that's required to achieve a lot of these goals, particularly in the context of African countries. So a lot of that discussion is still ongoing. I believe we have made very interesting progress so far, particularly on the electricity side, but we can accelerate it if we solve the finance, technology, the private sector role, and the capacity issues around that. We can accelerate those gains.
Absolutely. Now we have a question here. It says, the impact of energy on the macroeconomy. How do we relate the two? Energy, macroeconomy, growing economy. How do we play it?
I think we can look at it. It has various facets in terms of how energy can affect the macroeconomy. The entire energy system, if you look at it, it has, of course, electricity. It also has oil and gas, and it also has biomass, where more than 85% of our population relies on it. If you look at it, oil and gas alone, for example, countries in our region are devoting a big share of their hard currency on the import of oil and gas from outside of the region. I think in the case of Rwanda, we're talking about somewhere in the range of 40% of import bill is associated with oil and gas import, particularly in the previous period where the price of oil per barrel was quite high. It went down, now it's increasingly, it is coming up as well. So that has direct implications because if we tie a big chunk of our import bill on import of energy, that limits our capacity to import other capital goods which are needed for growth and economic performance. If you look at electricity, we had serious challenges if you go back 8 to 10 years ago, for example, the whole region was characterized by energy crisis coming from the electricity sector. Industries couldn't perform well because the supply is not stable, the quality is not there, the capacity is highly limited. So industrial expansion was highly constrained. That has direct implications in terms of not only how fast we grow, but the type of growth we'll have, especially around high energy intensive industries like manufacturing, there was that constraint. If you look at it in terms of biomass at household level, prices have been increasing, wood and charcoal prices. If you go to the market and ask people, they will tell you prices have been coming sharply. Some reports say by 11% per year for charcoal in Africa. That is the level of increase, which is very sharp. It constrains people's income to devote a big share of their income on energy as opposed to other areas that are highly needed for development. So energy can really affect the economy through various avenues and tentacles.
Here Boris says access to electricity is still very low, especially in the sub-Saharan region, let alone East Africa. So how can we tap into this? How do we solve this problem of electricity?
First, I think it's important to recognize how far we have come. The change has been quite dramatic in the last 5 years. For example, UNECA did a report on the state of energy access within the East African region. For Rwanda, it was around 16% about 5 years ago. The latest global reports are showing it's at 31%. If you look at it for Kenya, it was around 18-19%. Today we see numbers like 65%. For Tanzania, Uganda, you see those kind of very interesting progress that has been made. So that has to be appreciated and recognized. But that being said, still you have about 60-65% of the population that has not yet been reached. Now, the one case that has been made is if the policy is right, if the enabling environment has been sorted out, then that offers a very big environment, business opportunity for the private sector to come in. So part of the challenge is how to encourage greater role of more players coming. Part of that has been the policy constraint in the past that didn't allow much the private sector to come in and share the investment cost, bring new technology, and be part of the solution with the public sector. But increasingly that policy space is being changed. So I think there is a lot that needs to be done in terms of covering the remaining gap. But as you said, we can also view it as an opportunity for the private sector to come in and do that kind of business in Africa.
Before we tackle the policy issue, another person says, since 1990 there's been a forest stock decline, for example, we know in Ethiopia by 20%, Tanzania, but Rwanda has done great, in the region. But how can we improve this? How do we protect our forests? How do we not destroy our forests and the environment?
Actually, it's a very difficult question, something that has been tackled for decades now. And yet the progress when it comes to the cooking side is the most complicated of all the energy questions that we have today. Yes, there is rapid deforestation. In the last 10, 12 years, we see numbers like by 38% deforestation in Uganda, about close to 40% in Burundi. We see slight improvement in Rwanda by 17,000 hectares. But in many other areas, we see massive deforestation. So the challenge is how do you then transition people to depend solely on what you call solid fuels like wood and charcoal into alternatives like LPG and other bio-based alternatives, high efficiency cooking stoves and so on and so forth. That's a complicated problem. If you look at it, for example, in the context of China, in 2000, half of the Chinese population was doing the same thing on solid fuel, about 52%. By 2015, that number came down to 32%. So despite rapid progress and development and lifting a lot of people out of poverty, you can see that the cooking side sticks and stays longer. So I'm suspecting it will be the same problem we are facing. But we can accelerate it. One is, on the one hand, the wood and charcoal prices have been coming very sharply upwards, which means alternative technologies are becoming naturally more attractive for households. So we need to bring more technology options available for people to shift. We need to make them affordable. We need to increase awareness about them. So the more we reduce the burden on traditional biomass through all these kind of options, I think we see rate of deforestation is likely coming down until we reach a point where the entire system has to be made more sustainable. Currently, most people say it is a silent crisis because, for example, in Rwanda, there's a 29% gap between demand and supply, more demand than supply. If you go to Kenya, that number increases to about 80% gap. Wow. If you go to Uganda, 69% gap. Even today, the gap between demand and supply is quite huge, which means rapid deforestation. So our action has to be accelerated. Our solutions have to be accelerated and scaled up. So we reduce the burden by providing more options to households at the minimum.
When we talk about biomass energy, what are we talking about? And doesn't this involve cutting down of trees? This is a question.
Unfortunately, in our context, in many cases, that's what it implies, because you have in some countries, more than 90% of the population relying directly on wood and charcoal, which means it would imply necessarily to cut trees. But if you look at it broadly, it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. Rwanda has one of the most successful accelerated programs in biogas, particularly in rural areas where you can use animal waste and other biomass waste to gasify biomass and use it for cooking. And already thousands of households have been connected to that solution. It can be in fuel form. We have biodiesel. It could be in terms of bioethanol. So there is a lot of innovation and options coming to expand massively the options around biomass. The challenge for us is how do you go from a wood and charcoal-based, deforestation-based model to a very good business model that is commercially viable, that makes these technologies affordable and more appropriate into our context. The more we do that, it doesn't necessarily have to mean that the more biomass you use, it has to necessarily require rapid deforestation.
An estimated 657 million people, which is about 65% in Africa, rely on biomass, still cutting down of the trees for cooking. About 74% in sub-Saharan Africa and only 3% in Northern Africa. You see, only 3% in Northern Africa. Is it because they have better models than this side of the world that we're in, East Africa? Why is it that North Africa have lesser percentage comes to the use of biomass? Have they embraced technology than we have?
I think that's a good comparison. Most reports say sub-Saharan Africa because North Africa has made much progress. I would suspect it can be because of two reasons. So one is the biomass resource is not that much. You're talking about many countries where the large share of the land mass is already in the Sahara Desert. So there's not much biomass to rely with in the first place. So that would force you into alternative cooking solutions. The second is the level of development is higher in Northern African countries compared to many of our countries. Therefore, people have more income, more per capita income. Therefore, they can afford to go for alternatives. So in our case, even though we are deforesting, we still have a larger share of biomass stock by global assessments, which means we continue to rely on them. They're relatively cheaper. Secondly, income has not, or development has not risen sufficiently high to allow many people to go to alternatives. For example, some studies show that improved cook stoves of $50 to $100 per unit can be accessible only 20% of the population given income levels. So I think it's this dynamic between availability of the resource and the level of development that we have in our countries might explain why North Africa has rapidly went to alternative way of cooking, and the rest of us are still dealing with this kind of traditional issues.
Well, we do take a short break, but when we come back, we talk about policies, we talk about clean cooking, and of course what UNECA is doing to see that the energy sector grows, and especially in the clean cooking area. Do keep it the BQ. Welcome back, and thank you very much for keeping it the BQ. We are talking about energy, we're talking about clean cooking and how we in East Africa can grow, but also we as a country. We were talking to Mr. Yohhanes Hailu, who is the Economic Affairs Officer in charge of energy policy at UNECA. Before we went for a short break, we were talking about biomass and how some countries have improved. Now let's now look into in terms of policy. Earlier you spoke of policies that have been stringent, that has not opened up, what are some of the policies that are holding us back, and what should we do to improve them and make it easier for people to have clean energy?
Mm-hmm. That's a very good question. In fact, policy has been flagged as one of the main constraints in terms of accelerated gains in a lot of these energy objectives we're talking about. One is, I think we need to figure out how to scale up the engagement of the private sector. Because a lot of these objectives are very onerous in terms of resources, in terms of investment requirement, in terms of putting in place infrastructure. So putting that entirely on the back of the public sector would be quite challenging. The reason is a number of our countries are already accumulating debt, largely related to investment in infrastructure, which is quite needed. So that would tell you that that model at some point has to open up and bring more partners in, especially the private sector. To do that, we need policies. For example, we need invitation of the private sector to play, for example, in the generation side, which a lot of countries are getting quite comfortable around this, because the cost around generation using some technologies has sufficiently come down. It had created a comfort zone for countries now to invest, to invite the private sector to come in and invest in that area. So the policy has to be as open as possible, but as cautious as possible, to bring the right kind of private sector investment, to bring the right kind of technologies that would help us expand energy capacity without increasing long-term cost to the country. The second one is we need to think more carefully in terms of technology transfer.
Yes.
Because we have, in some cases, let's say, for example, solar energy. We bring a lot of solar technology from outside and we put it in what we call decentralized rural setting and so on and so forth. But there's a complete breakdown in the value chain because down the road you need to replace batteries, you need to replace some components. If those issues happen, then we don't have a direct linkage between the supplier and our rural households, which means we need to completely organize this energy technology value chain to make it more sustainable, and any progress we make, we build on it as opposed to regress from it. The other element in terms of policies is regionalism. How do we really tap in terms of the regional energy opportunities that exists? Yes, we have the challenge of harmonization, different policies, different approaches. Yes, we have the challenge of infrastructure connection, but I think we need to address that part so that we don't solve the energy problem only in our context, but we look at it from a regional collaborative option where cheaper energy can also be imported as that being part of the solution. So there are a number of policy components that if we relieve some of those constraints, if you open up more space, if we bring more incentives for private sector and regional players to come in, I think we can see more investment coming in that doesn't necessarily require 100% of that burden to be carried by the public sector.
Now let's just go straight now to bioenergy. Just look at how people are cooking, Give us a global picture of how people are cooking. What kind of energy are they using?
Globally, you mentioned it earlier, if you go to more developed countries, you see more use of gas and electricity as the main form of cooking. Biomass that accounts for maybe 3% of the total cooking and not quite significant. If you come to a number of Asian countries, they have aggressively pushed for LPG as an alternative. They provide,
which is what the LPG for viewers?
Liquefied petroleum gas,
yes.
Definitely. The cylinder
yes, the gas that you use at home.
That you use at home.
Yes.
And you see governments incentivizing that, providing subsidies, removing tariffs around that to make it more competitive. If you go to India, if you go to countries like Vietnam and so on and so forth, they emphasize those kind of solutions. If you come to the developing part of Asia and main part of Africa, we cook what we call the traditional way. It has been affordable and cheaper for quite long. So we have 85% or more of our population relying on wood in rural areas mainly, and charcoal in urban areas. But fortunately that is changing. If you look at how people cook now in urban areas particularly, there is yes charcoal, but now you see the cylinders coming in different sizes. People are trying the pellets, for example, as one option here in Rwanda. So different options are coming, but predominantly we cook through wood and charcoal.
So would you say the progress is good?
It's very promising, but we need to make much more progress.
Absolutely. Yes. Now, how different is Rwanda in the context of the EAC challenge, especially when it comes to clean cooking?
In many ways, I would say it is similar. The challenges are the same. For example, if you look at it on the supply side, where do we get wood and charcoal? You would see that we use similar technologies to convert into charcoal, yes. With efficiency around 11%. It is very similar in the rest of the EAC. If you look at how we market wood and charcoal, it is very comparable. If you look at the share of population using this kind of options, is very comparable. Where it is very different in Rwanda is we have not seen massive deforestation like we have seen in the neighboring country. In fact, FAO data shows Rwanda has a net increase, a slight net increase over time in forest cover. That is quite interesting, because how do you have a similar problem, but you're not putting too much burden? So part of that has to do with strict regulation of where wood and charcoal comes from, strict licensing, who is allowed to cut wood and to convert into charcoal and bring it to markets. It has to do with conservation of a lot of the resources that is taking place in Rwanda. All of those are, I think, good lessons we need to look at. But where there are commonalities, of course, Rwanda can work in tandem with other countries to look at solutions. Yeah.
But do you believe, or do you think the Rwandan strategy will help, actually?
I think the strategies in place, for example, some of the targets I've seen would like to see the 85% reliance on wood and charcoal coming down to 50%. You see targets, for example, improved cook stove to be available to 100% of the Rwandan population, which is a very ambitious target. If you look at in rural areas, to make at least 50% of rural households use more improved type of technologies that will require less wood for the same amount of energy to be gotten. So in terms of policy and where the strategy is, I think the spirit is in the right place, the targets are identified, the policy intention is very clear. Where it's going to be challenging in Rwanda is to encourage now the private sector to come up with very interesting business models that would help achieve reducing that reliance to 50%. On that one, still, I think there's a lot of thinking that will be required, but the policy seems to be suggesting in the right direction.
Now let's look in Africa, as a continent as a whole. You've mentioned how in Asian countries, China has done this. Why do you think it's taking Africa a bit, why are we dragging our feet? Why aren't we seeing these massive drops? We're just seeing a few countries doing what they can do, but in Africa, what's lagging us behind?
I think that's a very good observation. If you look at the global tracking reports, they're saying the same thing, that very good progress on electricity, very good progress on tapping into renewable energy. We're making really good progress, but when it comes to cooking, globally, that's where we suffer, where, in fact, some of the reports show that by 2030, even the number of people relying on biomass would actually increase, not even decrease, because of population growth in the continent. Part of the reason is there has not been much policy attention on the cooking side. For example, we regulate electricity, we regulate oil and gas, no one regulates cooking, when in fact 85% of the population depends on it. It's outside the regulatory realm in Rwanda and in many countries in Africa. That is quite paradoxical. That shows you that a lot of attention has not been going into the cooking side, therefore not much progress. The second is we have not seen large-scale business models. Some say, for example, Africans spend about $47 billion per year on wood and charcoal, quite significant market if you talk about it. But the private sector has not looked at yet how much opportunity exists in this particular space. There are very few companies operating at a very, very small scale. that model has not been scaled up and that opportunity has not been recognized. Of course, there are additional challenges too. So this lack of policy attention and this lack of recognition of the opportunity in this sector by the private sector has meant that we continue to do business as usual, and progress has been quite limited for quite a long time.
So what has UNECA done, or what is UNECA doing overall to support the acceleration of the transition of clean cooking, secure biomass energy for the future? What are you doing as a...
That's a good question. We looked at this problem from a different angle, from energy security point of view. When we say energy security, what we mean is there needs to be continual supply of wood and charcoal to the market in a sustainable way at affordable rate without the price going substantial. As we said, 11% per year or something. That doesn't show security. This concept is very rich. When you talk about oil and gas security, everyone understands it. If there is no fuel, then you see cars lining up or industries being frozen, and everyone will make an immediate noise about it because energy security around oil and gas are felt very, very immediately. If you look at it, electricity is the same thing. If there's no light, it's a very insecure supply, then you would notice it quite immediately.
Yes.
So we're trying to push this notion that biomass is also an energy security problem. That if we don't guarantee long-term supply, if we don't guarantee stable prices for average households, it's going to affect everyone long-term. So in this context, we worked with the East African community, with all the partner countries, including Rwanda, to come up with a framework on how to deal with this biomass energy security long-term. Through that process, we developed what we hope would be a usable and good policy framework for countries to look at. It addresses issues around how to sustain supply, reduce deforestation, make sure it is available on a continual basis. It addresses issues around how to deal with these prices going up in rural and urban areas, affecting households. And it deals with about 10 or 11 different dimensions of this problem, so that if countries design a proper policy around them, they have an opportunity to manage this problem from not only from an improved stove clean cooking perspective, but from an overall energy security problem at that level. So that is one work that has been completed with EAC, and we hope that countries will pay closer attention to that work.
So before I let you go, what would you say would be the game changer for all this?
I would say three game changers. One is technology. Technology is a big piece in terms of how we supply and how we use energy, both on the supply side and at household side. So we need to really, really accelerate good technologies to come in, improve efficiency, use less resources, and get more energy out of that across the entire system. So this thinking around technology would be a very big game changer. The second one is finance. How do we really, really finance these aggressive targets our countries are setting? For that, we need to really think through in terms of how to bring greater role of the private sector to come to the sector. That will be a big game changer. Third, for countries that have not done so yet, we need to design really very good policies that provide a lot of space and enabling environment for all the creative players to come in. I would say those three would be big game changers for us.
Thank you very much for making time to be with us, Yohhanes.
Thank you very much. I appreciate
I've been talking to Mr. Yohhanes Hailu, who is the Economic Affairs Officer in charge of energy policy at UNECA. And of course, he's given us tips on how we can protect our energy, secure it, and ensure that it works for everyone. Of course, do keep it a big Q, and do remember that you can keep suggesting who you want to see on the show and keep sending in your questions.